Next speaker is Shivanand Sharma. Now you get to speak. He's speaking on the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta approach to subjective awareness. Thank you.
I will.
Just getting your.
I'll stand here rather than sit, just because I haven't got as far as putting my thoughts to the paper yet.
Yes, sir.
So I don't have something
What
to
I
read.
will do-
I'll have to refer to the slides. So I'll just stay here.
What's this? No.
While this comes up, I just wanted to thank the organizers for having me. And I'll also request, if we get the opportunity later on, I would very much welcome and value your feedback on this, because I'm trying to develop it, and I'd like to understand how to refine this into something worthy of popular thinking.
This one here. How's that gone? Okay, we can't get
Maybe I
rid of
begin
that.
here. So
Apologize for this. We're trying to get it.
that's good. Maybe we can pause it on the second slide.
Second.
Thank you.
So do like I did last time. It's fine.
What I'm going to
For
try
now,
to
for now.
do is just locate what I think the Vaishnava account of conscious awarenesses within the contemporary debate on conscious awareness. I don't think I'll be able to come up with a precise definition as I'd like to, but from my understanding of the Vaishnava theory of consciousness, I'll try to situate it within that debate, and then I'll try to give some motivation for it, to say something about why you might think it's a good theory relative to contemporary debates. And at the end, I'd like to just flag a few areas of concern that I have, questions that I have about this theory. Next slide, please. Thank you. So first, I'll just briefly say what I understand by Vaiṣṇava Vedānta. I'll talk a little bit about conscious awareness. I don't think I need to talk much about it, because Tim has expressed it much better than I was planning to. And then I'll just focus on two questions that I think any theory, any account of conscious awareness needs to answer. Since the Vaishnava account that I'm presenting is an account of conscious awareness, I'm going to just say what I'm focusing just on these two questions. I'll show the contemporary responses and try to locate the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta account in that landscape. And then I'll give some reasons for favoring it and some problems that I think arise. And we'll end with a Q&A. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I take Vaiṣṇava Vedānta. It's a theistic tradition grounded in the Vedic texts of India. Tim spoke about Ramanujacharya. I do have a couple of quotations from him that I will draw on to try to justify my understanding of the Vaishnava account of conscious awareness. But in principle, I think the idea is that there's a plurality of souls that are ontologically dependent on some account of God that includes all of reality. And we have a few prominent advocates spanning through the centuries, and noteworthy philosophers like Ramanuja, Nimbaraka, Madhva, Chaitanya, Jiva Goswami. I don't think they all have exactly the same metaphysics. I know for sure that Madhva has a very dualistic ontology on the table, Ramanuja something more monistic. But I'm trying to focus, even though they may have slightly different metaphysics, I think they share certain commitments from the perspective of conscious awareness. That's what I'm looking at. Next slide, please. So I'm going to skim through these next few slides very briefly, because Tim has done such a nice job explaining it already. But perhaps you can reflect on the experience of pain and try to analyze what's involved in that experience. Moving on to the next slide. I think there's two fundamental aspects to any conscious experience. And if you're reflecting on your experience of pain, you can consider what the experience is like, what it feels like. It might sting you or burn you, or it's very unpleasant. There's a qualitative character side to any conscious experience or awareness. And then there's a more subtle aspect to your conscious awareness, what some philosophers call forminess of experience, a subjective character. So it's not just, for example, when I see a red rose, It's not just that experience isn't just about redness. It's also the fact that that redness is given to me. It's presented to me. There's a presentational side to conscious experience, a subjective character. And many philosophers say that what we call phenomenal character of conscious experience consists in a very intimate integration of these two aspects. So, taking a page from Tim, you can say any episode of conscious awareness involves an awareness of something, say the redness or the painful quality, by someone. That's the subjective side. So the awareness of the pain by the one who has it. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, that's what I'm going to be talking about, conscious awareness in that sense, in that very simple, intuitive sense. Here's two questions that I think are important for any account of conscious awareness to answer. First question, what is it that makes any given state of awareness conscious? What's the criteria for it? And then who is it conscious for? Let me say something about each of these in turn. Next slide, please. So first thing, which for me, when I first read about it, I found it counterintuitive, but not all awareness is conscious. We have, nowadays we understand, we study cases of medical conditions or cases of awareness that don't seem to be conscious, things like blind sight. In a blind sight subject, the person there may be some visual impairment, but yet, if pressed in certain forced choice questions, they will be able to report that they witnessed something happened, and they're remarkably accurate about what it was in this part of their visual field, even though they themselves would say they didn't see it. And you could think about subliminal perception as well, cases of experience or awareness that you don't even know you're having. So it's not subjective awareness, you're not aware that it's happening, but it's registered in some sense in a state of awareness. And we can say that part where it's being registered to you, that's what I want to focus in as the distinguishing mark of conscious awareness, the kind of awareness that is for you, that you are aware is happening, unlike what you find in cases like subliminal perception of blind sight patients. Next slide, please. That was the first question. The second question, who is it conscious, or who is the state of awareness conscious for? Who is it that's aware of this experience that's happening? Is it something that's existing over and above the experience, something in addition to the experience, something that would be there even if the experience wasn't there? So if you're giving an ontological picture of what's taking place, is it enough to just talk about the experience, or do you need to posit something else that is having the experience? Or is this for meanness, this subjective aspect of conscious awareness, just a feature of the experience itself, or the state of awareness? Is it that awareness is the kind of mental state that has a unique for me aspect or character, such that each mental state has something like that, but it's not that there's something outside of these states that are witnessing it or observing it and enduring beyond it? Now that's a familiar debate, and I'm sure most of you already have very strong views about that. Next slide, please. So that's kind of like the background context of what I'm going to be talking about. I looked at what I mean by conscious awareness. I talked about what I understand the Vaiṣṇava account to be. And I spoke about these two questions that I think any account of conscious awareness needs to answer. So now I'm going to try to locate what I understand the Vaiṣṇava account as being within this contemporary debate. How do they respond to these two questions? And is that something different? Is there something unique about the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta account? Or are they saying something that contemporary responses might not be saying, and is there some reason to prefer it? Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the first question. We saw that a state of awareness is conscious if it is for the subject. I'm aware that it's happening. But what does that mean? How would you model that in practice? And I've identified three general approaches in the literature. There's a functional approach to characterizing this subjectivity. There's a secondary awareness approach, and there's a reflexive awareness approach. What I want to say is the Vaiṣṇava account falls within this camp, but let me just briefly run through what they are. The next slide, please. On the functional approach, we say that a state of awareness is subjective. It's for its subject if it contributes to that subject's reasoning and behavior and decisions in the world. So I may have pain, and the reason pain is subjective on this account is that it disposes me to behave in certain ways. I might avoid certain kind of acts. I might protect myself in some way. And that's all it means to be subjective. It influences my behavior. But there's some problems with these kinds of accounts. Several prominent philosophers take this approach, but I think there's some problems with it. First problem is that there are many non-conscious states that also influence your behavior. You may have some traumatic experience that you're not thinking about, but it's affecting the way you behave. It's affecting your decision. So there may be mental states that are tokened in you that are disposing you to behave in certain ways. So they fit the bill of this approach to the subjective awareness or conscious awareness, but they're not conscious. You're not conscious of them. So I think this is neither necessary nor sufficient for subjective awareness. So let's move to the next option. This option says, and I think there are fewer philosophers who are motivated by this approach, but I think it's a stronger approach, the secondary awareness approach. On this view, a state of awareness is conscious, it's subjective, it's for you if you are aware of it. And that makes intuitive sense. After all, if I'm not aware that there's a pain happening in me, it's hard to see how that's a conscious pain. So on this view, not only is there an episode of awareness, say, of a red rose in my visual field, there is another episode of awareness by which, or in virtue of which, I am aware that I'm aware of a red rose. So I am aware of my experiencings. So there's a second awareness of my primary awareness. And that is what makes me conscious. That is what makes me subjectively aware or consciously aware. That's what's different between me and the person who is experiencing subliminal perception. Well, not experiencing, but who is subliminally perceiving something. Or the blind sight patient. They are not secondarily aware of their primary awareness. They're registering it, but they're not aware that they're registering. But this also faces some problems. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but one famous problem is that it's known as the transparency of experience. When you reflect and introspect your own experiences, think about that pain experience you had, and you try to be aware of your experience itself, all you seem to be aware of is what the experience is about, what we call the intentionality of the experience, the offness. For example, all I can seem to be aware of is the way the pain feels. When I try to think about that tree out there, my experience of this green tree, all I can think of when I introspect is the qualities of the tree or the qualities that are presented. I can't seem to identify any phenomenal properties associated with the experience itself, only of what the experience is about. So it's hard to see how we can be aware of the awareness, what that's contributing over and above what the primary awareness was contributing. That's one intuitive challenge that's often debated in the literature. I think a more important problem with this, though, is an infinite regress problem, because we seem to be positing if the only way to be consciously aware of something is to posit a secondary awareness, then you have to ask, what makes that secondary awareness conscious? And you start off on this infinite regress. Some philosophers like Rosenthal, who talk about higher order theories of consciousness, they don't think this is a problem. for my part, I do think it's a problem, but I don't have, if you're interested in that, we can talk about it later on. I don't want to dwell too long on it here, but I think that infinite regress problem does bite for this kind of view. Next slide, please. Now, this is the one, reflexive awareness approach to the subjectivity, fullness of conscious experience. This is the one that I think, this is the camp that I think Vaiṣṇava Vedānta falls into. On this view, conscious awareness isn't just some functional thing. I'm not sure if I emphasized it earlier, but part of that functional, one of the problems with that functional approach was that it's hard to see how this felt quality that Tim talked about could be glossed in or explained in functional terms. I can have those functions taking place without feeling anything. So for the Vaiṣṇava approach, conscious awareness or experience in the world doesn't seem to just be functional. Neither does it seem to be in virtue of a secondary awareness. For the reflexive awareness approach, we just have one episode, one event, one act of awareness. But that awareness is reflexive in the sense that it makes you aware of something, but in that same act, it reveals itself. I think in Indian philosophy, I'm not an expert in Indian philosophy, but I think in Indian philosophy, this is known as swat prakasha or self-illumination kind of theories about consciousness, where they reveal an object and they reveal themselves at the same time. So the subject who is undergoing this experience, when they have that episode of awareness, they are aware not only of what is revealed by that episode of awareness, the tree, the pain, the apple, they're also aware of the experience itself in virtue of the same act, not in virtue of another awareness. So it's a kind of like a one-order account of conscious awareness. It's non-composite. Of course, this is a more difficult kind of view to square with the naturalistic ambitions of contemporary Western philosophy, at least, of much contemporary Western philosophy. So that might be seen as something unwelcome. But I do think this is the kind of view that the Vaiṣṇava approach takes. Next slide, please. So here, for example, I don't know Sanskrit, so I can't really read what Ramanuja is saying, but I have a few resources that purport to explain what Ramanuja is talking about. And here's one statement that from a book that to me was really helpful in understanding Ramanuja a little bit better. According to him, Ramanuja defines consciousness in this way. Consciousness is the illumination through its own being of some object to its subject. And I take that to be compatible, or at least I take that to be the reflexive approach to conscious awareness. One thing, awareness, its own being, in virtue of its own existence, it reveals an object to its subject. It doesn't require anything in addition to come into the picture. Next slide, please. That was the first question. What is it that makes a state of awareness conscious? Or how do we give an account of the consciousness of a state of awareness to distinguish it from those states that are not conscious? The second question is, who is the thing that's conscious? I said before, there's two ways that philosophers tend to approach this. Either they see the subject that is conscious as something in addition to the consciousness, or they see it as something, as some aspect or feature of the conscious awareness itself. This looks like the wrong slide.
Is this one then?
Sorry, could you go up?
That one?
This one. Oh, okay. Well, maybe something got deleted on the way. But
How about that one?
that's all right. No, you can go.
Down.
Yeah.
That one?
The one. Yes.
Oh, hold on. Yes to this?
This one.
Oh, yeah. This one.
Yes. Thank you very much. Here's a couple of quotes from Ramanuja, again, from that same book, where he says the self in its proper form, is a cognizer. Neither simple awareness nor essentially insentient. Consciousness manifests itself solely through its own being to its own substrate at the times when it operates. Now, what I want to say is that this kind of view, this kind of statement, seems to be talking about, he uses the word substrate, it seems to be talking about something that is ontologically prior to the experience. So the experience depends on the subject in some way. It's not that the subject depends on the experience. There's I spoke about these two general approaches, the experience-first approach, which some of the slides are missing here, but the experience-first approach is the one that talks about the subject as being part or a feature of the conscious experience. But the subject-first approach talks about experience, it flips this away, the other way, where the experience depends on the subject, much like a dent depends on the surface in which it's a dent of a surface. The surface doesn't depend on the dent. The surface could exist even if the dent wasn't there. In the same way, a subject of experience could exist even if it didn't have that experience. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So they must have slipped down. Let's go to the next one. So I spoke earlier about the experience-first approach. I'll just quickly say what the problem is, I think, with that. Because for many people, that's a very conducive approach to contemporary theories because it doesn't posit this mysterious entity sitting outside the conscious experience. It's just all you need to do is analyze the mental states to get to the subject. I think it's a problem because I think it contravenes a lot of our basic intuitions about how subjects relate to their experiences. I said earlier, I gave the example of the dent on the surface, but what I was trying to get at was this intuition that as a subject, I could have had a different experience. At least that's how we intuitively think. But if all I am is a feature of the experience, it's hard to see how I could have had a different experience because I am determined by the experience that I'm having. And I think that doesn't sit well with our intuitions about how we relate to our experiences. It also implies, for example, that I only exist so long as my experience exists. Because if all I am is some feature of my experience, then when this experience goes away, then I go away in some sense. So that's why I don't see the experience-first approach, even though it's quite prominent, and I take this to be the kind of approach that characterizes most of Buddhism. I don't find it intuitively appealing, even though I know the Buddhists wouldn't take much stock in that response. They're not trying to align with my intuitions in the first place. They're giving a revisionary account. But that said, I still think there is something to be said for trying to give an account that at least explains our intuitions. Next slide, please. The subject-first approach. This is the one that I think Ramanuja is advocating. And I don't think that's controversial because on these Vaiṣṇava theories, as Tim has explained, they're theistic, so they want to have a relationship between God and souls, and these two things must be distinct, and although not ontologically separated, but they need to be existing so that they can relate to each other. I need to be an individual substance of some sort, even though I'm dependent on God, so that I can relate and have a meaningful relationship with God. So the subject on this approach, the subject isn't something within the experience, it's something outside, well, not outside, but something that sits over and above the experience, something that can exist even when the experience doesn't exist. That could be an organism on some accounts, it could be a brain. On the Vaiṣṇava account, it's a soul of some sort, the Atman. Now, there's problems with this, though, and these kinds of problems have led people away from this kind of view. For one thing, it's hard to see how a body or brain could be the subject of an experience because they're insentient. Even if they instantiate some sort of phenomenal property, it's hard to see how the thing that is aware of the experience is the actual material of a brain or a body, because the fundamental nature of a material entity is opposed to sentience. So I struggle to see why a body and brain, even though it kind of aligns with the subject first approach, I struggle to see how that could fit the bill for a subjective experience. The subject has to be something that phenomenologically participates in the experience. It can't just be something that metaphysically is some sort of base that allows phenomenal properties to come up. It has to be the thing that is aware of the experiences, the objects of experience. It has to be the thing that for whom the experience occurs. So you might say an immaterial subject is the thing that fits this bill. That's the kind of subject that Ramanuja is looking for, an immaterial subject. Although we don't seem to have any direct experience on it. For those of you familiar with Hume, that's one of the really famous things that he's known to have said and has influenced a lot of people. When he looks into his own experience, he doesn't see this thing separate from the experience. All he sees is his perception. Next slide, please. Let me just sum up so far. How much time do I have? Let me just quickly sum up what I understand by Vaiṣṇava Vedānta so far, and then address a really important question. So for the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta account, a state of conscious awareness is a state of an immaterial subject. I think that's what Ramanuja and the Vaishnavas are pushing for. And it's a state that makes that subject aware of both the object and itself at the same time. It's not the kind of view that the Buddhists or maybe the Advaita Vedantins might have, where the experience reveals objects to itself. It's not that the experience is its own subject. The state of awareness makes the subject aware, it makes its subject aware of its object. And it also reveals itself at the same time. That's the kind of account that I think the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta proponents are pushing for. Now, next slide, please. When I thought about that, I just thought, isn't this just plain old Cartesian substance dualism? What's different about it? Yes, I know there's a sort of metaphysical framework where the subjects on this view are somehow part of God. And I guess on the traditional Cartesian picture, souls are something that are not part of God, they're created by God. But when it comes to conscious awareness, does that matter for an account of conscious awareness? For all intents and purposes, they seem to be saying the same thing. Consciousness is a property of some immaterial subject. Consciousness is reflexive in the sense that it reveals the object and it reveals itself at the same time. Descartes was insistent on that point. Subjects are essentially conscious. They're not the kind of thing that aren't conscious, and subjects are immaterial. So that's meant to be a picture of Ramanuja that I found. But they're supposed to be, they sound like the same thing to me. But I think they are different in a really interesting way. Next slide, please. Remember the first question we talked about, what makes a state of awareness conscious? And the reason that has become a really important question today is because unlike when we were in Descartes' time, for Descartes, as I understand him, he thought that we're conscious of all of our mental state. You can't have a mental state that isn't conscious. But we do seem to have mental states that the subject isn't aware of. We talked about blindsight subjects and subliminal perception. So what would Descartes say about those views? And it's hard for me to, I'm not a Descartes scholar, but it's hard for me to see how he would respond to this claim that there seem to be unconscious states of awareness. So, as I understand it, traditional Cartesian dualism can't accommodate unconscious states of awareness, and that's because Descartes locates mentality within the soul, and the soul is necessarily conscious. So the soul is conscious of all its mental states, because mentality sits in the soul. Next slide, please. I don't think Vaiṣṇava Vedānta says quite the same thing. And I find this quite interesting, and I welcome Those of you who know more about this, I welcome your insights on it so I can try to develop it further. But for Vaiṣṇava Vedānta, not all mental states are conscious. And that's because they're making a distinction. As I understand it, they take on board the Sankhya metaphysics in this respect. They make a distinction between immaterial souls and the material mind. The mind is some attribute or some part of the body that's mental, in the sense that it's not just a physical thing, maybe in space and time, but it's functioning in a way to be, it takes content from the environment through the senses and it organizes that content in some way, but it does so in a completely unconscious way. Like in subliminal perception, or like in blindsight subjects, the mind seems able to receive information, input from the senses, organize it, but we may not be conscious of it. It's happening below consciousness. So the mind, or the mental representations of the mind, seem to be unconscious. They lack subjectivity, and I think that's the bit that the soul is adding into the story of conscious awareness. Subjectivity only comes into the picture when the soul somehow becomes conscious of the content of its mind. But it's not that the soul and the mind are the same thing on this picture. I want to flag that this might sound like the secondary awareness approach I talked about earlier, where you have some kind of mental state that's unconscious, and then you have something else that's conscious of it, another mental state that's conscious of it, rendering it subjective. I don't think philosophy is giving a reductive consciousness. What they're saying is that consciousness only is within the soul. The soul is reflexively aware of the content of its mind, and the mind is able to gather content from the world in a completely unconscious way. So the soul is adding subjectivity, and this mental tool or instrument is adding content. Oh, sorry. That's all right. I'm near the end. What's the next slide? So just really briefly, in a minute or two, why I think this Vaiṣṇava view is worth exploring and investigating further. Unlike the functional accounts, it does pay due regard to the phenomenology of conscious experience. It's not just some function or disposition. There is full-blown technicolor phenomenology, as some philosophers say. Unlike the secondary awareness accounts, it's not reductive. It doesn't suffer from this infinite regress problem that makes us worry that we can never really get consciousness into the picture. Unlike the kind of experience first accounts of the Buddhists or people like Harvard, it seems to fit with our intuitions about how subjects relate to their experiences. Yes, it is a subject first account, but there's different versions. And we saw there's like a materialist subject first account, whether it's a body or a brain. But unlike those accounts, it seems to explain how you can have a subject that's phenomenally participating in its conscious awareness. And unlike Descartes' account, which is the closest one, I think, to the Vaishnava one, it seems to make room for non-conscious awareness. I think the last slide. Oh, sorry, the one just above. Yeah. I don't think it's all rosy, though. I think there's a couple of problems, at least things that I haven't been able to answer. If we take this on board, then are we saying that the soul, all this is doing is contributing subjectivity? That's a problem for me, because when in these theistic accounts, the soul is meant to be something that can continue without its body, in some state of liberation or salvation. So what happens then? Does the soul need some material mind for it to be conscious of? And without that material mind, what happens? What happens in a state of liberation? And if it is in this relationship with the mind, what is that relationship? I find that difficult to kind of get my head around. Is the mind the thing that where our psychologies reside, and the subjectivity is only in the soul? Or is there some kind of subjectivity in the soul itself that carries on to a state of liberation? I'm not sure. I think for the Vaishnavas, they would say that. They would say that the real person is not the empirical person, but the real person is the soul that can enter into a relationship with God. But how does that fit into this account? It's hard. I'd like to spell that out a bit. Let me end there because I know I'm over time. I think that was the last slide anyway. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Shivananda, for that. We've got about 10-15 minutes for questions. Then we can probably take about 5-minute break if you want to get some coffee to the back there, and we can move on. Okay, so we have Bishop.
I have a question, but you seem to have answered in your last sentence, but I will ask you nevertheless. So first of all, thank you for a fascinating paper, really.
Yeah.
And I see what you're trying to do to distinguish Vaiṣṇava Vedānta concepts from Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta, similar concepts. Now, you bring up the point of the subject, the soul, and I'd like to ask you whether you'd be open to consider that the soul itself is personal, which I think is the real distinguishing feature between Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta concepts and the Vaiṣṇava Vedānta. Perhaps not so much in Ramanuja, maybe developed later and gradually with Madhva and probably with Jiva. We have also other Jiva experts here, so we may ask. But are you open to consider that actually this is the unique feature of Vaiṣṇava Vedānta, that the soul itself is a person, not just Satchitananda in abstract terms, but actually a minute person aspiring for relations with the Supreme Trust?
Absolutely. I find that the most appealing version of Vaiṣṇava Vedānta myself. So I do see the soul as a minute person, as you say, in an eternal relation with a supreme person, God. All that I'm saying here is that what personhood consists in needs to be distinguished from what empirical, what this personhood of the soul consists in needs to be distinguished from the personhood that we have in these temporary psychophysical complexes. So right now, I might, according to the Vaishnava view, I might have a certain psychology as a person of being male, 40 years old, and living in Basingstoke, but that's temporary. That's not the essential personhood of the soul. It's a kind of a construct of the material mind that makes me identify in that way. But the soul itself is a person, but it has a uniquely spiritual kind of identity and psychology. I think those are the theological aspects of the view that I myself think is the strongest view for a theistic account of consciousness and relationships. I don't want to go into that side of things. This one, so far, I'm just trying to say how I think that view spells out, how that view plays out, when you talk about conscious awareness in the bare bones. And I think it plays out as this person is the subject, the soul person is the subject. But in this current experience that we have, that subject is aware of the contents of the material mind that's even identifying with it in a very strong way, but it's not it. And I understand Vaiṣṇava Vedānta to be supportive of this kind of metaphysics, which I think it imports from Sankhya, this material mind and false ego and these sorts of concepts. I think it does work, but I think, as far as I can see, this aspect of the soul itself being a psychological subject, and psychology not just being in the material mind, to be its own psychological subject that's eternal, I think those are the theological aspects of the view that I think are very appealing so far as theological views go. Thank you.
It's been a while since I read Descartes. But do you think that the Cartesian view, if you just added like some developed account of attention, like where blind sight happens because people are conscious of their awareness, but they're not paying attention to it, for example, do you think that could just sort of accommodate the,
The
like,
non-
would it become like very similar to this view? Or, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how attention relates to like the subjective and qualitative character, and if that makes the view like a lot more similar to the actual.
That's a great question. And I do think, I mean, obviously Descartes was understood that there's intentionality to conscious awareness. He explicitly also said that it's a reflexive account. But for him to accommodate non-conscious awareness, he would have to say, I'll defer to the Descartes experts on this point, but I think he would have to say, because he locates mentality in the soul, it's the soul of the mind, as far as I can read, kind of like the same thing on the Descartes picture. He would have to say that for there to be unconscious awareness, there must be some state of the soul that's unconscious. But I understood him to be saying that the souls are essentially conscious. It's an essential attribute. Consciousness is an essential attribute. It's the mark of mentality. That's what I understood his theory to be. So you can't have mentality that isn't conscious. That's the distinguishing mark of consciousness. So, sorry, of mentality. So perhaps there's a way for him to make space for just focusing on the intentional aspect of consciousness and stripping away the subjective aspect so that he can have a non-conscious mental state. But I don't know, I don't want to speculate on Descartes in that way, although I think it's a really valuable, a really interesting research avenue. And if he is able to do that, then yes, it becomes much closer to Vaiṣṇava Vedānta. But what's interesting about Vaiṣṇava Vedānta is they do have this other thing that's not part of the soul, which is what they call manas, or the mind, that is a seat of mentality that isn't conscious. I don't know if Descartes would want to endorse something like that. Maybe he would, and I'd be interested to know if that's the case. Is that all right? Sorry, you look like you wanted to come back on something.
I said attention.
Oh, attention. Sorry, I thought you said intention. Attention.
Okay, I don't want to take too much time on this. I'll talk to you.
What do we got? We got Ricardo.
Yeah.
If there's any questions on that.
We have time for question because I think the time you've gone over your time. So, but Ricardo, yes, yeah.
Okay, I'll be very quick with the response.
Thank you, Shivanand. That's also a nice thought. And I think it's an important thing to work and letting the tradition and kind of translate it into our vocabulary. Just one comment. I might have a kind of problem with your use of the term Vaiṣṇava Vedānta. Because, as you mentioned, there are so many thinkers and they have so many different positions, and of course, they disagree with each other. So I was just wondering if, in this specific subject matter, if we can like have a list of features, like as you try to do, that are common to all Vaishnava traditions, and just to give you an example of that, when you distinguishing like your view from the Descartes view, and what you mentioned, it seems to me is much more like a Sankhya idea. I mean, to distinguish between like the material mind and the so-called spiritual mind. That of course many Vaishnava thinkers they adopt it, but it seems to me that originally it comes from Sankhya. So it's just an example that to point out that perhaps it's not as simple as it might appear to call such a thing as a Vaishnava Vedānta tradition. But I don't know if you have something to say.
I think it's a valuable point that I need to be. It would be worth me investigating whether all Vaishnava schools would buy into this picture. My impression is that they would, because it's the view is all about conscious awareness as opposed to the relationship between God and souls. That I think that they part when it comes to that kind of metaphysical story. But so far as the question of what is it that's conscious, what consciousness consists in, I understand Vaiṣṇava Vedānta to be all these thinkers to be endorsing something like this. On your point about Sankhya, I agree. There's some kind of Sankhya elements in here. But I think those Sankhya elements are supported by the foundational texts of the Vedanta tradition, like the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of their core texts for all Vedanta, not just Vaiṣṇava Vedānta, but the Vaiṣṇava Vedāntas pay special regard to the Bhagavad Gita. There was a distinction made there between soul and mind. It's like one of the core statements that Krishna gives in the Bhagavad Gita. He makes a sharp distinction between what is subconscious and what is not conscious. The mind falls on the physical side of things, interestingly. But I'm going to look into this point and see if I can give a more precise distinction between the different Vaishnava schools. That would be helpful for scholars in those different traditions. I myself don't know. I'd like to be more of a scholar in that and the Indian side of things, but I don't know enough about it. Is that okay, Tamar?
Yes, I apologize to anyone online who's ready to ask a question. Maybe later on we can do that.
Or you can email me.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.